Hello, we are about to get started, so I would ask everyone to please turn off your cell phones. And this is going to be live streamed through Univision News in the United States and across the world. So if you could just take your seats, we'll begin in about a couple of minutes.
Oye, no se te oye nada aquí.
Ya sé.
Es puro, sí, pero
bueno, para...
si vas a hablar con nosotros,
okay. Good point.
Tenemos que oír.
Good point.
Es que no hay bocinas.
Yo, sí, aquí están, acá están atrás.
No están prendidas.
Checamos eso.
Qué gusto ver.
Sure.
Sí, mucho. Tenemos que echarnos un desayuno uno de estos días que da vestido. Ahorita te doy una tarjeta cuando volvamos al cuartel.
Yo creo que voy a ponerme de pie un rato y después... Yes? Wonderful. So I think we're ready to start. Let me begin by introducing our panel today, and I'll begin in the corresponding order of how we're sitting. But before, of course, ladies first. Angélica Fuentes, Chief Executive Officer of OmniLife Mexico. Angélica, welcome.
Enrique, thank you very much. It is a great pleasure for me to join my co-panelists and you as our presenter for this panel. And I would like to say a word of congratulations to your recent promotion.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well-deserved.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Enrique.
Angélica. Before we start, I'm going to just tell everyone Mexico's Manana is the theme of our discussion. We're going to give each participant 5 minutes for a brief introduction. 5 to 7 minutes. We've all agreed that we won't go beyond that time, and if not, I'll have to interrupt. And after that, we'll begin a questions, discussion, conversation amongst the panelists, and then we'll open the questions to the floor. So, sorry for interrupting. That will be the last time during the table, or during our session. And please, Angélica.
Great, thank you. I will use my time discussing two issues that were presented for us in this panel. One of them has to do with the challenge of violence, and the other one has to do with promoting social inclusion. Because I'm a Mexican businesswoman, I would like to speak from a gender perspective. In Mexico, the population is around 112 million people. 57 million are women. And without the full integration of women in the Mexican economy, there is not going to be any sustainable development in the short, medium, or long term. First of all, I would like to talk about facing the challenges of violence. When we speak about violence in Mexico, the first thing that comes to mind is violence that has to do with the drug cartels. There is another kind of violence that affects Mexico as significantly as the trafficking of narcotics in the social and economic, and has social and economic implications equally as grievous to this country. And this is the violence against women. Let me just mention some numbers. Out of these 57 million women in the country, according to recent research, 7 out of 10 are victims of physical violence and threats. Only 1 of 10 victims goes to court to press charges. They don't do it because their fear of reprisals from their partners, their fear of being left without an economic sustainability for their families if they leave the spouse or the partner who has been violent towards them. And 30% of the men who do this to women in our country go through an economic blackmail against the women, and therefore it makes them have a very low self-esteem. In the past decades, the Mexican government has done some very good initiatives as far as legislation is concerned. For example, Ley General de Acceso de las Mujeres de una Vida Libre de Violencia in 2007, as well as programs of assistance, which is the Centro de Terapia de Apoyo a las Víctimas de Delitos Sexuales in 1991. I think Mexico is reasonably equipped as far as institutionally things are concerned to protect women. But full enforcement of the law programs is something that we're lacking on. So I think we really need to move and push forward on having those laws being enforced. The violence, domestic violence for women, result in a loss of economic opportunity for the country. A woman who has been victim of violence is a woman who cannot be productive in the economy. The public sector and the private sector need to come together to work on sustainable solutions. We need to enforce punishment to stop domestic violence. We need to create centers for legal and psychological advice, as well as construction for shelters for women who want to escape abusive situations. We also need to focus on education to create opportunities to have women access employment. Now, on social inclusion is a vital ingredient for economic sustainability. From 1950 to 2009, the female population economically active in Mexico zoomed from 13 to 42%. This is why the lack of job opportunity and the low level of economic participation of women has serious implications for the future of Mexico. Especially if you consider that 25% of households in Mexico are headed by women. Once again, both the private and the public sectors need to have opportunities to design and promote initiatives of social inclusion in various areas. For example, in 2010, this is another issue that's very important. The female population in a reproductive age is 28 million, almost 0.5% or more than 0.5% of the total women population in this country is in a reproductive age. And I don't think that we're gonna have a successful integration of women in the economic force without really also addressing the issue of motherhood. And another very good data is that 35% of the employed female labor force has access to daycare. We also need to address the issue of daycare for women. Women are the ones always looking and searching where it is that they're gonna leave the children so they can be out and looking for jobs, especially if they really want a better job. Sometimes women stay in jobs where they cannot move on forward because the company probably gives them a form of taking care of their children. And if they want to succeed or better themselves within another job, maybe they don't take the advantage because maybe that other place of work does not offer a place for the children to be taken care of. The other issue is health. We have done great, or this government has done great progress in this with the Seguro Popular. Now 42 of the 50 million people that did not have health coverage are now being covered, but there's a lot more of this to be done, especially when it comes to issue about women. Women have to have places where they can get mammograms, where they can get pap smears, or where they can talk and discuss their pregnancies. And so we need to have more clinics specifically for women. And the last issue that I want to discuss as far as social inclusion is concerned is education. We need to close the gap in education. There are a lot more women being educated in this country, but there's still, for example, in the sciences, only 24% in the UNAM are women. As far as engineers, there's also a very low percentage of women being engineers in this country. So we also need to close the gap on what women are studying. There are companies who really are promoting, for example, technology in their companies and allowing women to understand that it is a very cool job to have. So there's a lot in education that we need to do as far as closing the gender gap. Mexico is the 13th largest economy in the world, but we rank number 58 in global competitiveness. And we have the gap gender in 89 out of the 135 countries. And if we close the gender gap, and we can really elevate the competitiveness in the country. So we absolutely need to move forward as far as closing that gender gap between men and women. And I think we really, truly have a great opportunity with women to be more competitive in this country.
Thank you, Angelica.
Thank you.
I guess violence, social inclusion, the gender gap, three main issues of your introduction. Ambassador Rosenthal, please, 5 minutes for a brief introduction, and on Mexico's Mañana.
Thank you, Enrique, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. This morning, we heard President Calderón summarize a lot of Mexico's achievements over the last 2 decades or so in terms of investment, in terms of the emergence of a middle class, in terms of economic reform, investment in infrastructure, and so on. I'd like to concentrate my introductory remarks on the other side of the story, which is what are we still missing? What is it that Mexico needs to do to be able to meet what Angelica has just referred to as true global competitiveness? And I think the best way to summarize it is to talk about the 3 states of monopoly that we have in Mexico: political monopoly, economic monopoly, and social monopoly. On the political side, the monopoly relates fundamentally to the political parties. We have 4 registered political parties that are competing for the presidency on the elections that are going to take place on the 1st of July. And we have no possibility in Mexico for non-registered party individuals to present themselves as candidates independent of the political parties. The political parties that we have are, by and large, with one exception, fairly old, fairly stagnant within their structures, and it probably would make a big difference if in Mexico there were a possibility of renewing the political party system, either with new parties or with reformed parties that were able to meet some of the expectations that we as Mexicans have of the political system. One example of this is on the question of democracy. Mexico has made enormous strides in achieving democracy at the national level, but we still are a long way from achieving true democracy at the state and at the municipal level. The checks and balances that democracy brings are not as present at the local levels as they are at the national level. The second of the monopolies is the economic monopoly, and this is both a private sector and a public sector issue. In the public sector, we all know that we have an energy monopoly in Pemex and in the Federal Electricity Commission, and in several other areas of public sector economic activity. And in the private sector, there are also monopolies which detract from Mexico's true competitiveness. I think we heard this morning, I wasn't present, but I think you heard this morning 2 of the presidential candidates talk about the need for change in terms of Pemex, to look at the example of Petrobras and other national oil companies around the world that have managed to make the transition that we have still not managed to make, mainly for political reasons, but also from my perspective because there has not been an adequate explanation to the Mexican people about what it means to own a resource versus create a monopoly to exploit that resource. The final monopoly is the social monopoly, and it's a very, sometimes ignored, but a very important one. and that is principally evident in the structure of labor unions. Our labor unions in Mexico are antediluvian. They are really labor unions that might have thrived sometime in the 19th century, but have no business being what they are in the 21st century. And it is absolutely indispensable that together with the labor reform, together with energy reform, together with state reform, together with all the other structural reforms Mexico has to undertake, we also undertake a change in the way unions operate in Mexico in terms of their transparency, their finances, the way their leaders are chosen and elected or not elected or inherited in some cases. I think those are the three big challenges for the short and the medium term that Mexico has in order to become not only the 13th largest economy, but as some forecasters have said, the 5th largest economy in the world, but also a very competitive economy. And until that happens, we will still be lagging in some of the areas that I've mentioned.
So the missing ingredient, I guess, and three monopolies, you can summarize it under those themes. Carlos Represas, member of the board of Swiss Re, a quick introductory round, 5 minutes, and then we'll go on with the rest of the panel, of course, and to start our question session.
Thank you, Enrique. I would like to refer to two subjects on the purpose of this panel. One being the fostering of social inclusion, to which already you referred to in your presentation, and the other one related to the structural reforms. And I would like to put the two of them in context, because there is no doubt that the best way to foster social inclusion in our country is by expanding the internal market. Because bringing those Mexicans that are not part of the Mexican economy, are part of the Mexican society, but they are not part of this economic activity of the country, is the best way of bringing them through this market expansion that we need internally in Mexico. And then the question is, how do you expand the internal market? In my opinion, there is only one way of expanding the internal market, and this is by creating employment. Productive employment is the only way to expand the internal market in this country and to bring people into this market. And then the question that comes after is, okay, now, how do you create employment, productive employment? Well, there is simply one way to create productive employment, as far as I know, and this is through investment. Public investment, private investment, foreign investment, local investment, doesn't matter. But the only way to create employment is through investment. And we're talking about productive employment. Then the question is, okay, now how do you create investment? How do you stimulate investment? And then the answer is very simple, is doing the structural reforms that we have not done in this country. And this is the way of closing the circle in between the fostering of the social inclusion on one side and the need of the structural reforms on the other side. Because at the end, the ultimate goal of the economic policy of this country is that, on one hand, we transform this country from a country of 116 million inhabitants into a country of 116 million consumers. This is the best way to look at it and say the objective has to be that every Mexican should be able to have a job whereby he can afford for himself and his family, I put it this way, 3 warm meals a day. And that has to be the objective. And the only way is through employment, through investment, and for that the structural reforms are fundamental. Then the question is, okay, which reforms? Okay, I think that we have talked a lot in this country about the structural reforms. As a matter of fact, I would say that we are overdiagnosed in terms of the structural reforms. But one important thing is that we have to prioritize those structural reforms. And in my personal opinion, the first and most important structural reform is the judicial structural reform, because we have to guarantee in this country the rule of law, what we call the seguridad jurídica. And this, for me, is fundamental if we really want to push investment in the country and therefore employment. And I would say that in second hand, it's very important to talk about the educational reform as well as the fiscal reform that are required in this country. And last but not least, the labor reform that is also fundamental in this country. I think that if we look at the possibility of having in the next administration the priorities clearly stated on which are the structural reforms, I think that we will see the impact of these reforms in terms of employment. And this, for me, is the point where all political parties in this country can get together on the common objective of creating employment for the country, because this is, at the end, the only one that is going to guarantee to us the social peace in this country.
Thank you very much, Carlos Represas. 2 of our panelists have already referred to the elections. We'll get to that point as soon as we are done with the introductory round. Álvaro Rodríguez Arregui, founder.
We lost it.
We lost you.
Is it back? I think it's back, Enrique.
Thank you. Álvaro Rodríguez Arregui, thank you so much. Ignia, founding partner, of course. 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, and Mexico's Mañana.
Sure. So obviously the theme of this panel is about Mexico of tomorrow, and it's interesting that part of what this panel has set the floor on is, from my point of view, a lot of means. But I think for starters, I would like to make an invitation that we need to start talking a little bit more about the vision for this country. And I would like it to be a very daring and ambitious vision. And Carlos Eduardo started to talk about that vision. But what type of country we want to build? Is it a country and like an economy based on exports or based on our internal economy? Is it a country mostly based on industries of the past, or is it a country mostly based on industries of the future? And very importantly is, how much of a social inclusive country do we want, and how much social mobility do we want? Clearly, like for example, in the recent book, Why Nations Fail from Acemoglu, he clearly states that we are not an inclusive country, and we really need to be an inclusive country for growth. So I think we need to focus a lot of that, and because a lot of discussion always is on the means rather than the end. But I'd like to focus much more on the actors. So who are going to be the actors that are going to build this country, this Mexico of tomorrow? And is it going to be the large Mexican companies? Is it going to be the foreign large companies? Or is it going to be the entrepreneurs and the social, the small and medium-sized enterprises, or also called SMEs? So who who are the actors that are going to be playing here and what role are they going to play. And on that part, obviously, an actor is the government. And for starters, on what I think the government should be doing is the government needs to stop being the provider and it starts being the facilitator. I believe the government needs to stop falling into the temptation of doing rather than facilitating, motivating, and regulating, and that's what they should focus on. But I like to especially focus on the actors of the private sector. Now, for starters, obviously we have the foreign companies, and we need to stay very open for foreign companies to keep coming and investing, but we also need to motivate the local economy to keep an equilibrium on that. Now, on the large companies, by definition, large companies cannot grow that much. And for the country to grow, the private sector needs to grow. That's by definition. And large companies, well, guess what? They don't tend to grow that much. And also, it's interesting because when we compare ourselves, for example, to Brazil, large companies in Mexico grow about twice the growth of Brazil companies. But Brazil is growing 2 times our growth. So there's something going on here. If our large companies are growing more than the Brazilians, why are they growing much faster than we are? And I think it has to do with the mobility of SMEs and the creation of SMEs and the facility for entrepreneurs to actually prosper. Now, so I'm a big believer that if we want for this company to grow, it needs to be bottom-up. Now, when I say bottom-up, I'm not talking about microenterprise. And no question, microenterprise needs to be supported. But I'm talking much more about SMEs. And just to give you some numbers, in order to achieve 1% growth in the economy, you need 105 small and medium-sized companies becoming large. On the other hand, you need 273,000 microenterprises in order to get 1 percentage point of growth in GDP. So let's focus on the SMEs, and let's focus on the SMEs growing and becoming large. Now, obviously, in order for this to happen, a lot of the discussion is about the structural reforms, and I'm the first one to say that we need them. But also, there are great examples of companies that have been able to be very successful without structural reforms. So, you know, we've been too focused, spending a lot of energy on that, when there are actually many things that can happen without the structural reforms. We have cases like OmniLife, represented here by Angelica, Compartamos, Electra, Cinemex, many cases which have been tremendously successful, small and medium-sized enterprises that became large without those structural reforms. And we need to be focused on solutions of the future, because more and more quickly the solutions of the past are becoming very, very obsolete. Now, what are some of the key things that we need for small and medium-sized enterprises to grow? We need a level playing field. We do not have a level playing field in Mexico. We need access to financing. We need government playing a role. Also, we need to facilitate and for SMEs, and I can get into that in the questions and answers, or some specific proposals that I can give on what are the things that we can do. And lastly, I believe that not only is SMEs, but SMEs that focus on the base of the pyramid to make it a truly inclusive Mexico.
Thank you very much, Alvaro. We've been very disciplined with the key points of the discussion: promoting structural reforms, increasing investment in infrastructure, tackling violence, fostering social inclusion, the secret ingredient, the monopoly issue, and of course, Moise Cherem, CEO of Enova. First of all, congratulations on the Social Entrepreneurship Award that was presented to you today. And it's a great project that you're heading. 5 minutes, and then we'll start with the questions. And Mexico's Mañana.
So I believe that Mexico's Mañana can actually be brilliant. And I think that we have all of the conditions that we need to truly succeed in the next 10 years. I think two things need to happen for us to have this brilliant future. The first one is a change in perspective. And I think that we have a lot of lessons to learn from Brazil in this respect. If you look at many indicators, such as expected growth for this year, inflation, unemployment, and a host of others, Mexico actually performs slightly better than Brazil. Nonetheless, if you go to Brazil, you have the sense of optimism. I was there 2 weeks ago, and they feel, A, that they're going to win the World Cup, which they're hosting, and B, that everything is really going to be fine. They have a murder rate that is higher than Mexico. Nonetheless, they believe that by intervening the favelas, everything will be fixed in the short term. Talk to a Mexican, talk to a Mexican housewife, and we have really become really anxious in these past few years. And there's a reason for that. We've been submitted to violence. Our way of life has really changed. And I think the media has really had a role to play we have basically two extremes in the media. You have the official media that is extremely positive, no one believes it, and then you have all of the intellectuals saying that everything is wrong, and we really do not have much in the middle. And what makes front page news is, some political problem rather than the fact that, an SME grew or that an SME was able to really go through a breakthrough. So first point, change in perspective. And I think, we have a lot of leaders around here. It is our job to do that. I think that Brazil had a group of leaders that went around the world saying, Brazil is the greatest investment opportunity. You have a lot of conditions that are going to be great. We as Mexicans need to start doing that. And if we meet someone who's American or French, we need to stop saying, oh, Mexico's terrible and the violence and all of that. I've lived here all my life. I've been mugged once. I do know a lot of incidences. However, a lot of Mexicans, even if we are afraid, you can have a perfectly normal life here. Unfortunately, that is not true for most Mexicans, but in terms of investment, I think most of investments can actually be done and can succeed despite of the violence. The second element is that we need to work. All of this focus on structural reforms has really led to paralysis. I'm going to focus a little bit on education because that is my field. Something really positive happened in Mexico, which is that now we take educational performance seriously, and that is becoming front page news. In Mexico, we recently had a movie that basically depicted all of the problems of the educational system, and it had a huge success. So now you have housewives who know that there is a problem. The problem is that this can lead to antagonism and to paralysis. We as citizens can just hate the teachers' union. The government can just, claim to be doing some progress, but I think we're focusing our attention on the wrong part. We need to focus on improving. We need to focus on which actual mechanisms can take a 9-year-old kid who's not performing in math and he's not learning, he's not understanding what he reads, and we need to think about how to do that. And I think that can actually be a more fruitful discussion. It's a discussion that we can have with teachers, and if we work together, we can make people improve. I'm going to tell you the final reason why I think that Mexico can have a very good future, which is my own experience. I've been extremely lucky in this country. I did my grad school in Harvard through a scholarship of the Mexican government, and we have been able to grow a project working in conjunction with the government. We started doing this when we were 26, and I would always think if we were in Spain, we were in the United States, we would never be able to go to any ministry and tell them to trust 3 26-year-olds with a really good project. And this project is now a reality. We have about 235,000 people who are part of it. We have positive impact evaluations. We're really creating solutions that we need in Mexico. So again, I may not be representative for all of the population, but I think if we have more examples like the Red Innovación Aprendizaje, more examples like the SMEs that Alvaro is talking about, this country can really succeed.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're done with our introductory round. I think when we discuss the future of Mexico, Mexico's Mañana, we are all a little, I don't want to say pessimist, but we have this doubt about what's been missing, why Mexico hasn't grown and why isn't it at a level in which we would all like it to be. The candidates are receiving all kinds of ideas, proposals on how they should go about their campaigns, how they should lead if they result, if they become a winner in July. What would you tell if you had one idea, one proposal, any of the candidates, you were their principal advisor, and you could tell them, you should bet on this, just one idea. And I'm going to start with Andrés Rosenthal, Ambassador Rosenthal. What would that idea be? What would you say to the candidate, you have to concentrate on this and put all your eggs in this basket?
I think the point that was made by Carlos Eduardo Represas is a very important one, and that has to do with establishing rule of law. There is an unfinished agenda there that has been on the table for politicians for a very, very long time, and yet today, probably in Mexico, there is still not what we would call full trust and confidence in a rule of law or in the judicial system. In order for any society to work, there has to be trust in the authority, trust in government, trust in the police, trust in the military, and I think that we still need to do that. So I would tell the prospective presidential or prospective president that would probably be the #1 priority.
Rule of law. So that would
Rule
be
of law.
the judicial reform, of course.
Well, it includes judicial reform, it includes police reform, it includes creating a national police force, which is one of the issues that has been very much on the agenda of the presidential candidates. It includes what I call civismo in Spanish, that we as citizens learn to respect the law rather than to find ways to go around it or above it or below it. All of that, it's an educational process, it's a reform process that has to do with the structures of society.
Angelica Fuentes, what would your proposal be?
My proposal would be in education. I think an educated country is a country with a future, and I think we need to change the reform and education for the children. We need to really educate in what Andrés was saying, not just math and science and history and literature. I think we also need to educate in values. I think that is something that we have really missed out as a society and has brought us to where we're at today. I really think that a society who's educated on universal values like respect would be a society that in the future will not have to go underneath, above, around the laws. A society that's educated in knowing what it is to be honest and knowing what it is to respect is a society that can prevent a lot of what we have today. So I would definitely advise on education.
Do you think you can teach that in a classroom, or is also something you have to do at home? Is it a virtual cycle that
I think it's a whole. I think it's something that you do have to teach at home, but it's also something you have to enforce or reinforce in school. It's also something I think that we, as business people, can also do. For example, us in OmniLife are working on this incredible program that a university in Monterrey is working for us in a project that has to do with how can we re-educate our own employees in those values and how it can be taken out onto their families, their friends, and society. So I think it's just something that has to be worked from all the different levels. It starts at home, but it has to be reinforced in school. And I think it also has to do with business people participating in that part of education as well.
That's the second time you bring up the role of the private sector in Mexico's Mañana, so I think we have to go back to that point. Carlos Represas. your proposal for the next president?
Well, to be consistent with what I expressed before, my top recommendation would be to really act on the judicial reform, to guarantee that in this country we can have the rule of law prevailing. And I think that that is very important because at the end, all other reforms, if we do not have the rule of law in place, these other reforms would hardly take place. Because how can you do that? How can you do a good educational reform if you have the legal situation that exists with the teachers' union in this country? How can you have a good labor reform if you have a union corruption system in place in the country? So how can you have an energy reform if you favor certain corruption practices on the monopoly that Andres was referring to? So the fundamental thing is that we have to fight against corruption. We have to fight against the power that has been used in a discriminate way by politicians and by other groups of interest. How can you do that without having a rule of law and a legal guarantee of your own property and of your own activity? That's why I am very much in favor of putting a priority on these reforms and acting decisively first on this judicial reform and then cascade it down on the other structural reforms that this country needs and that we have talked a lot about, but we have not done much.
Thank you so much. Álvaro Rodríguez Arregui, I know you have a few ideas on this issue, but what would be, if you had to choose one, what would be your top priority?
I would tell this new presidential candidate to be a little bit foolish and a little bit unreasonable. There's a quote by Bernard Shaw, which I believe very much, that says, "The reasonable person adapts to the world, the unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to herself or himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable people." So I think one of the issues that we have is we have a horrible mix of impunity and over-regulation. And we need to break that. And the reason why this president needs to be a little bit foolish and unreasonable is because the top elites of this country, we don't really want to change a lot because we don't have the benefit of the doubt that that change is going to put us in a good position. So we need to have the courage of our convictions and to really embrace change for this social mobility and for this social inclusion. And with that, there will be winners and losers. But in order to accept the fact that there are going to be some winners and losers, and they're going to be dead and wounded in the process, somebody needs to have that courage of their convictions, and that courage will need a little bit of foolishness and a little bit of unreasonableness.
A lot of them, I would say. Thank you so much, Álvaro. Moise, your idea. You're the youngest one in this panel, so I'm guessing you'll have something that can shake up things a little bit.
So my advice would be to focus on the values and aspirations that we have in the Constitution. I think the distinction between left and right is somewhat archaic. Mexico as a society has already elected through democratic means what we want. And we know that we want education, we know that we want health, we know that we want a good environment. So ideologically, that is the base. And then the president needs to be pragmatic on how to get there. So if we want universal coverage, what is the most effective way of actually achieving that? What is the way that will prepare people for the challenges of the future? And along those lines, I think that the frontrunner, Enrique Peña, actually did a good job because the thesis of his book is basically that, to grab all of those constitutional rights and go from formal equality to material equality. So if he manages to do that, I think that will be really good news for Mexico.
Wonderful. Why don't we open the floor to questions? And there are people around the hall that can take a microphone. I see a few hands raised over here. Your name first, please, and who would you like to have your question answered?
Juan Manuel Gonzalez, and I will open the question for the panel.
Sure.
I see the panel a little bit pessimistic on Mexico's Mañana. 4 out of 5 are counting on if the reforms are not done, Mexico doesn't have a bright future. And I'm not sure if I'm getting the right message from the panel. I think I'm stick with Moise in terms of, I do believe Mexico has done the work, the homework in the last 20 years. I think we're ready for a bright future, and it's about leadership. And I think the best example of the panel is 5 great leaders that has done in its own forum a great job. I think it's about each one of us doing leadership in our own arena and changing our forum. So I don't know if a brief comment on leadership from any of the panelists will be
a brief comment on leadership, and how pessimistic or optimistic are you about Mexico's Mañana? Because it's a good point. Maybe we are a little pessimistic on the tone.
I don't think it's pessimism. I think it's to some extent realism. I think it behooves us as Mexicans to make sure that where we are going continues to build on what we have done over the last decades. I don't see it as pessimistic. The topic of the panel was Mexico's Mañana, but you specifically asked us to talk about structural reforms, about the issue of the challenge of violence, about social inclusion. Well, all of those are to some extent negatives, and therefore, if you address them, you have to address them with a certain amount of realism. I'm as bullish about Mexico as Moise or you. I think it's not that's at issue. I think we have to be realistic. We have to understand that we still have a way to go and that we have issues that we need to resolve. You know, you will remember the years in which, I certainly remember them, being probably the oldest one on the panel, in which we were told that we were fine and that we were perfect and that we had to learn to administer our abundance. Well, I think we need to be realistic, and I think that whoever takes over the leadership of this country on the 1st of July after the election needs to look at the country in terms of the realities in which we live. And the realities include some of these things we've been talking about: impunity, corruption, violence, lack of education, of civic education. I'm very much in favor of what Angelica said. I think we need to, you know, I went to school and on Saturdays we had to go to civics lessons. Every Saturday we learned how to be good citizens. That's gone. We don't have that in schools anymore in Mexico. On the contrary, I think young people today look at the way that others behave and they find that the best way to get forward es el que, to use a Mexican expression, el que no tranza no avanza. I think this is a big problem and we need to address it.
Anybody else wants to take a crack at that question?
I just want to make a comment. I don't think we're pessimistic either. I believe there is a lot to do, and I'm going to talk about, you know, closing the gender gap. I think there are great expectations and there's so much work to do, and I really believe that if we truly help and include more women in the workforce, I think that this country can be, you know, at the same stage as a world economy competitively. I think we can be competitive by really closing the gender gap and not being pessimistic. I'm being, you know, like Andres says, we're just being realistic. There is a lot to do. The important thing is that we all here are committed to doing what we discussed and talked about and moving on forward. One of the issues for me, of course, is closing that gender gap. I'm working at that, and I'm very positive about knowing that with the different entities that we've been working with, we are going to achieve a lot. It will take probably more than my lifetime to totally close it, but we're working on it, and I'm very optimistic of what we can do and how we have to move forward in this country.
And that's coming from a woman, successful businesswoman from Ciudad Juárez. So I think that it's also important to take notice of. I'll give you the microphone. Oh, there's one.
Hi, to Mr. Represas. You speak about rule of law and the judiciary reform that actually was passed by Congress in 2008, the criminal reform, and how important is civic engagement and social participation for things like reforms to pass? How can we empower more citizens to get involved in that? Because I think you're all talking about something that could be top-down, but Alvaro said it has to be bottom-up. So how do we empower people to care about the reforms and to care about rule of law and to embrace it?
I think a good way to frame that would be, are elections enough, or the role of the citizen has to go beyond just voting and really making sure that holding the governance accountable?
Well, I would say that there is a consensus today in the country that we need some fundamental structural reforms. And I think that is not a matter of empowering the people of the country, because when you discuss openly with other people in the country if we need an educational reform, if we need a labor reform, if we need an energy reform, if we need a fiscal reform, everybody would agree on it. The problem is that to get a reform, a fundamental structural reform done, you have to do it in the Congress. And to get it through the Congress, you need the political consensus to be built around it to get that reform moving forward. And this is something that we have not been able in our recent democracy to generate this kind of political consensus among the fundamental parties in order to move forward the political agreement to get the reforms done in Congress. So I think that here we see a certain disconnect between what society wants, and when you talk with society, everybody's convinced about it, and what is really happening in the Congress between the political parties in terms of reaching an agreement to get those reforms forward. That is the fundamental problem.
Do you want to comment, any of you, on the role of the citizens here in Mexico? Some call it the era of the citizen. During the last 6 years, there's been somehow an awakening, of a social awakening of people trying to get involved more politically, socially, from the private sector, maybe. Alvaro?
I think we need to focus on two things. One is we need the Mexican private sector to take a different approach towards social development. So if you look at Mexican philanthropy as a whole, it is really incipient. And at the same time, we have NGOs that are pretty small, their models are not scalable, so we need a different discussion. Private companies need to realize that progress is in their hands, and then we need entities. They can be private, they can be social enterprises, they can be NGOs that actually execute social projects well and that can execute systemic change to fix education, insecurity, all of those things. So I'm a big believer in getting the private, social, and public sectors to work together, and I think if we really roll up our sleeves and get to work, we can fix a lot of the country's problems.
I think we have time for one final question over here.
Your son.
Can you say your name, please?
My name is Emmanuel. Mine is more of a compliment and adding something on Angelica, what she was saying. Actually, I'm a Mexican, for those who don't know. Angelica Fuentes is my mom, and Jorge, they are my adopted parents. So recently, I came and I was taken to Juarez, where I happened to be sharing my story to young people. And the story I was sharing is I'm an ex-child soldier from Sudan, and now I'm a rapper. And so, and on that way, I was able to connect with a lot of young people. And then I went to the prison to go and tell my story and perform also to Alcatel's members. And when I look around and then I was talking to the people, what I'm focusing on is the values, as Angelica was saying. If the crime need to drop down, I mean, the police, everybody just say the police are bad. We can't trust police. And so that is making every police, even the good police, not to really work hard. So if there's a situation where the police can be made heroes, if a police has done something good, and they can be recognized in the public, and also it will motivate somebody if a phone call rang that somebody is coming to do this. A policeman will be willing to die to save that family and I think that could help reduce the crime. And the other thing I was thinking could be very controversial. What about if the drug business has been legalized, for example, cocaine, because would the crime drop down? Something like that. That's
legalization was a big issue and a big topic during the Summit of the Americas this last weekend. The major leaders of the world united there. They didn't include it as part of the official agenda, but they discussed it. I don't know what your stand is on legalization now that they brought it out. Ambassador Rosenthal, if you want to comment, anyone who wants to comment and jump in on it.
Well, I think it's a very important issue, and it is an issue which I think today finally has become a topic on which politicians are willing to engage. Up until now, it's always been former politicians, former leaders who have discussed it, but with what the President of Guatemala told us this morning and what has happened at the summit in Cartagena, it's clear now that there is a growing frustration, especially in Latin America, but I would suspect it also in other parts of the world, at the fact that the strategies we're following are not leading to success in terms of either reducing the consumption, the production, the sale, or any of the aspects of narcotics. I'm personally in favor of revisiting the whole issue from a medical point of view, from a sociological point of view, from a legal point of view, because what we have today in place in terms of the legal instruments that govern the issue of drugs and drug use are over 100 years old. And the fact is, and I think Emmanuel has just said it, young people today have a different attitude than we had or that our parents had or our grandparents had. So I'm very happy that President Perez Molina, President Santos, President Chinchilla, and some of the other leaders have decided to grasp this issue and to talk about it. It doesn't matter whether they're in favor of legalization or would just like to see a debate on what it is we're going to do to change the current situation. To
change this strategy. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're going to end the panel about Mexico's Mañana talking about the need to change this strategy on the global war on drugs. Alvaro, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on the drug situation, where something definitely needs to be done. Now, we need to keep in perspective that from the profits of for the criminal cartels, 40% is drugs. For example, 30% is human trafficking. So they will find something to do. But the bottom line here is the search for opportunity. And they're looking for a search for opportunity for business, for a profit. And that, in general terms, is because there is a lack of opportunity in other areas. So we need to create the systems, the environment for people to be able to pursue their opportunities and to act at their fullest potential. That's what we don't have today. And they get cornered into having to look for this type of opportunities. We need new innovations, and those innovations will come bottom up. By definitions, we leaders are not innovators. The innovation comes from below. And that's what we need to create that environment. And it might sound pessimistic, right? But maybe it's a little bit of frustration because there's so much opportunity in this country that it's a little bit frustrating that just with a few tweaks, not having to do huge structural reforms, very much needed, but even, we have been talking about them for 20 years, but even, and there have been tremendously successful cases without those structural reforms. But we can do much more. And just with a few things that can be done, I think this country has a very bright future.
Angelica, Carlos, Moise, if you want to comment on the issue of drug trafficking, drug consumption, legalization, decriminalization.
You know, I'm not an expert on drug cartels or drugs either. But I would tend to agree with Andres. I think it is very important that it's in the agendas of different presidents in Latin America, of the President of the United States. And I would also agree with Andres that it needs to be revised again, and it needs to be talked about openly. And the expert would have to come in and, place the facts on what's happened to countries who have legalized it, what's happened to states, within countries who have done it, and take it on from there. But the most important issue to me is that it is in the agendas of a lot of countries now.
A necessary debate.
Exactly. I'm totally in agreement with Angelica.
So it's interesting how the politicians that spoke today, they need to use euphemisms to talk about legalization because, they're elected presidents. But I think it's interesting to think of what legalization would actually look like. And I think that tobacco can be an interesting analogy. So the US has been successful in reducing the rate at which people consume a very addictive substance, which is tobacco, through prevention and through some regulation. The problem with tobacco is that the starting point was a point where you could have camel ads, where you would have a cartoon advertising how to smoke. I think if the Americas were to regulate drugs, you could start from a very different point. And you can, as a government, you can set as many distinctions. You can differentiate among different substances. Heroin and marijuana have really nothing to do with each other. And I think that if we think about that starting point, plus the progress that you can make if you spend all of the same time and resources to just getting people to not consume drugs, you could have a lot more success minus 60,000 deaths.
Well, I think that concludes our panel today. We were giving some key discussion points, and we went over those, but I think we also covered ground in other issues and in other topics. So thank you so much, everyone. Ambassador Rosenthal, Angelica Fuentes, Carlos Represas, Álvaro Rodríguez Arregui, y por supuesto Moisés. Moy, thank you so much.
Thank you. Very good.
Muy bien.